Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a terrific event for you today on the upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive against the Russian invaders of Ukraine. We have General Wes Clark as one of our speakers, former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. We have Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who's the Senior Fellow and Director at the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security. We have David Kramer, the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute and a former Assistant Secretary of State. We have Vladimir Milov, Vice President for International Advocacy of the Free Russia Foundation and a former minister in Russia. And we have Andriy Zaharanyuk, former Defense Minister of Ukraine and a distinguished fellow at our own Atlantic Council. So we have, again, a very good conversation today for you. We'll start with Andriy. Andriy, what is the situation on the battlefield? There are numerous reports that Ukraine has taken back Wagner positions south of Bakhmut. What is going on there? And under what is the significance of the British decision to send Storm Shadow cruise missiles with a range of 250 kilometers?
Indeed, we have a number of the successes in limited areas of Ukrainian armed forces. They are based on the fact that Ukraine has a very capable forces there. They have a very good commanders, probably one of the best which we have altogether. They had a very professionally well done the defense campaign over this period of time. And as soon as they see that the Russians are already exhausting themselves, and as soon as they see that their capabilities are being basically they don't have that enough of their weapons, they don't have enough people, they don't have enough arms and ammunition to conduct further the assault campaign, they have started to take some areas back. Also, we know that armed forces of Russia are trying to take some of the Wagner's positions. They try to kind of move closer to Bakhmut, and obviously that doesn't make it stronger because most of those forces are comprised of the mobilized personnel with very little training, and so that doesn't make them stronger. So overall, we can clearly see that the offensive, which was announced back in the wintertime, never had. Well, I mean, they tried to conduct it, but it's actually never succeeded. And at the same time, it's already exhausted. So basically, it is over. So initiative is firmly in the Ukrainian armed forces. However, situation is extremely tense. So to say all those like statements, I mean, it's one thing, but to actually go through this is difficult. It's much more different. So I'm in touch, and I met a number of the personnel and commanders who are actually commanding this operation right now, just recently, days ago, and of course their position is very intense. So we cannot say that things are easy there or became easier there. It's still very tough and still very, very demanding, and the casualties rate is still very high, and so on. Many people ask whether this is this counteroffensive which everybody was talking about. I would say that even if it's a part of this, I mean, obviously that's not the main event. So the main campaign is still being expected. I mean, there are still forces training for the main event. There's still a number of preparations happening as we speak. Regarding the Storm Shadow, obviously they will make a massive difference depending on the quantity which they will be passed, but their range and the type of weapon it is, it's of course it's a great deal for Ukraine. We monitor Russian information space, including the information space among militaries. They all are very concerned about that because indeed the whole logistical architecture around the east and the south were all built based on the HIMARS range. So they did not expect those ranges. And right now we see some movements. They're trying to regroup and move some of the stockpiles and some of the C2 stations and basically command and control points and so on. They're trying to move this backwards, understanding that they will be vulnerable. The intelligence which we have is extremely good. So we know exactly where they're all located, where the decisions are made, where the key stockpiles are. So I believe very soon we will see some results of that. So the expectations are quite optimistic about this particular Storm Shadow.
Thank you. Okay, Wes, as Anzi pointed out, Moscow's vaunted 2023 offensive seems to have petered out in Bakhmut. There are credible reports that Russia is finding it difficult to mobilize and equip additional troops. Do you agree with that? And how do you view the prospects for Ukraine's upcoming counteroffensive? But first, unmute.
I'm hopeful but concerned. Let me say why I'm hopeful, and then let me say why I'm concerned, okay? So, we've done a lot of training with Ukrainian forces. They've got new brigades. They've got a lot of Western equipment. They've done rehearsals. We've given, I think, from the West, the best kind of preparation that we could give for this force. We haven't given everything that Ukraine needs, and we'll come to that later. But certainly we've given them a lot. And as Andre said, perhaps most important is intelligence. And we feel like we've got really good insights and understanding of what's going on. Now, the thing about military operations is you never count your chickens before they hatch. Ultimately, the greatest factor is likely to be the determination of Ukraine to regain its territory. It's the will to fight. It's the courage of the soldiers at every level. It's the determination of the commanders to make it work. There's only really two kinds of military plans. There's plans that might work, and there's plans that won't work. So hopefully we've gone through this enough that we've eliminated the options that won't work. And then it's up to the commanders at each level, and most importantly, the soldiers at the bottom. Can they put steel on target? Can they respond effectively under fire with their own artillery? Can they fend off a Russian airstrike against their unit as it's on the move? And so there's a lot of soldier skills here at the bottom that are going to be critical. Why am I concerned? Because you always have to put yourself in the mind of an enemy commander on this. And what would you do? This war is different than any previous wars the United States has seen, and certainly anything different that the Russians have seen, in that operational security is extremely difficult in this environment. There are drones, there's satellites, there's electronic information, there's all kinds of reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance. From the outside, we can't see the status of the surveillance, counter-surveillance battle that's underway. Is Ukraine able to blind Russian satellites? Would the United States do that for them? Can we really break in to Russian communications nets? Is it true they don't have any military secrets? There's no reserve force that's been held back there, trained and concealed. They can't launch their air force against a moving Ukrainian column. We know they've got 900 or so aircraft that could come in. They can't overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses in a specific area at a specific time and smash that offensive. I mean, those are all the things that I would be concerned about if I were a commander in Ukraine. In addition, there's got to understand that when you run an operation like this, you've got to have your reconnaissance forward. How's that reconnaissance doing? I don't like the fact that the Russians cleared out the civilian population around Melitopol and Zaporizhia, because we need those people. They're our eyes and ears, and probably, although we don't know this, they're probably partisan fighters working for us in those civilian populations. But the Russians know this, and that's the motive I see behind the clearing out the civilian population. So I'm concerned. We've got to get the right path through the obstacles. We've got to have the ability to block what the Russians know about us, and we've got to look at what the likely Russian response will be, air and ground, and be able to handle it. So hopeful, sure, but concerned. This is a long fight. I don't think this is going to be a blitzkrieg that's over in 2 weeks. So that means logistics is a priority. And we know that the United States and the West have not successfully dealt with the logistics problems that face this plethora of equipment that's coming in from so many different nations. So there are a lot of things out there that I'd be concerned about if I were a Ukrainian commander and trying to put myself in their view, in their seat, and also looking at what the Russians would do to counter. Hopeful, but concerned, John.
Thank you, Wes. Great stuff. Okay, Vlad, I appreciate your take on Putin's ability to mobilize hundreds of thousands of additional troops. Also, some observers claim that one important reason for the failure of Moscow's invasion is that corruption diverted significant resources from the supposed military modernization into dodges and yachts for senior defense officials. Also, another possibility or another reason is that Putin seems to value loyalty rather than competence among his military commanders, as we've seen with the move of Surovikin and his replacement by Gerasimov. Your view on all this?
Hello, everyone. First, I think it's clearly problem number one for Putin now is the quality of manpower. And a very important question here is why hasn't he yet called for a second wave of mandatory mobilization? Was expected like pretty much every day in the past 8 months after the first wave, but it didn't happen. And I think for the upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive, it's clear that it would be already too late because training of the mobilized manpower takes some time. So they will be really ready for combat not before September, probably, which means that it's useless already now to mobilize significant numbers of people to counter this potential upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive. An interesting question why Putin is not doing that, and that the answer, I think, illustrates a lot of constraints that Putin has. Constraint number one, I think it's pretty clear that Kremlin was absolutely unhappy with the reaction from the Russian public opinion. You saw that public approval and support had greatly plunged since mobilization was announced in September, and it sort of stabilized, but Kremlin is very much afraid of this potential domestic destabilization. One important issue is that mobilization comes with significant exit of skilled workforce from the country in hundreds of thousands at the very least. If you listen to all that economic commentary of the moment, the deficit of skilled workforce is already a biting issue number one for economic recovery in Russia. So they just don't want another exit in big numbers. That's pretty clear. And yet, on the other hand, I think what is important is that the quality of the mobilized personnel is so poor that I think they probably do not deem it to be worth it to go these great lengths, to go and face another plunge in public support, massive exit of workforce from the country. For what? To mobilize personnel which is really not capable of fighting. So if they still go with a new major wave of mobilization, I think it would probably be out of desperation. If they may face significant losses with this new Ukrainian counteroffensive, but it's clear that they don't want to do it now. And I think, again, one of the answers is that the quality of personnel that was mobilized since September is relatively poor. First, in terms of skill and training, and second, in terms of morale and motivation to hold ground. I believe that what we hear about some units of the Ministry of Defense actually abandoning some of the positions around Bakhmut, what we heard about lately, is an illustration of that. And there are reasons to believe, we know some of the feedback from the people who have relatives there on the battlefield and so on. The morale is so low, everybody is actually expecting a very strong Ukrainian counteroffensive. So the possibility of a collapse of a front, if Ukrainians will massively begin shelling and bombarding the Russian positions, they are not negligible at all. Many of these people are really not prepared to fight, neither in terms of skill, nor in terms of morale and motivation. Many of them will just run. This is what we hear as feedback from the Russian troops who are stationed there. So I think Russians do have some strengths. As General mentioned, they still have significant air power, which I think will be used. And I think what also Putin counts on is that in the past 6 months after Ukrainians liberated Kherson, Russia has been heavily investing in not only fortifying the occupied positions against potential counteroffensive, but also they installed a lot of mines. That might be a significant barrier for a successful counteroffensive. I think they're counting on that, but the weak part is the personnel, the manpower, which is again lacks the necessary skill and morale to fight and hold their ground. What is also important is that they didn't just mobilize everybody since September. They went for very specific military specialties, trained people, and they really do have some major shortages here. First, in terms of field commanders, from lieutenants to sergeants, you see that some major colonels or major high-rank commanders are being killed at the battlefield. That is a sign that they have really no middle ground here. They have a very serious lack of lower-level commanders, commanders of units, and so on. The other thing that everything from drivers, operators of vehicles, and so on, we hear a lot of feedback economically, because there's a very severe deficit of drivers across the country now, because it's been wiped out. Everybody's been like recruited for the battlefield in Ukraine. So they really lack some of the critical skilled military specialties and so on. So in this regard, it means that manpower is Putin's Achilles heel, is his weakest point. And I just wanted to finish with general assessment, because I'm participating in a lot of discussions like that about the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think the principle that should be taken is that Ukrainians should be given all the time they need to prepare for it, because somewhat I see, too much pressure on them, psychological pressure, which, well, I put my faith in Ukrainian military, but I think when you have so much pressure from all the sides and from Western allies, might stimulate somebody to go ahead with certain moves which might be not as well prepared. That would be wrong. I think Ukrainians proven in the past 15 months that they know what they're doing. So they should be given all the time they need to prepare for this counteroffensive, not rushing in prematurely.
Vlad, a very quick follow-up here. A lot of Western so-called experts insist that time is on Putin's side. You seem to be suggesting something other than that. Your quick comment.
No, definitely. Putin wants you to think that time is on his side. That's a lengthy discussion about the impact of sanctions and military defeats and so on. Impact is big. Also, John, you mentioned corruption. That's an important factor which never went away. So there are very serious constraining factors for Putin. He wants you to make it look, to think that time is on his side, but this is just another psyop. And as a matter of fact, this is focused at politicians in the West and public opinion in the West, which might think that, oh, this is turning into a lengthy war. We need to scrap support for Ukraine. We need peace talks and so on. Don't fall for it. Time is not on Putin's side. His resources are being exhausted by the day.
Thank you. Andrea, I have a question for you, but I'll ask that question. But if you want to comment on what's been said, you're top-notch expert. But here's my question. As Vlad and Andrei and Wes point out, there are problems on the military side for the Russians. They've also had a bad time recently, you might say, on the diplomatic front. You had that vote at the UN where China, India, Brazil, and Kazakhstan endorsed the resolution that condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine. And then you had that interesting statement by a senior South African official suggesting Putin should not come to the BRICS summit in South Africa because he would have to arrest him as an indicted international war criminal. So your thoughts on that, but also anything that's been already discussed.
Yeah, I'll jump on the question of whether or not time is on Russia's side. And I think that's a really hard thing to answer. But I think my concern is the longer that the war goes on, the greater the risk is that Western support for Ukraine will tire. And we do see some signs of US public support, for example, on Ukraine weakening. So, and I guess from my perspective, in the work that I've done, I don't think that Putin really has any incentive to end the war. Continuing the war actually benefits Putin because it helps him become more resilient to all of the domestic challenges that are mounting. So in work that I had done with a colleague of mine, Erica France, we looked at what happens to wartime dictators since the end of World War II. And we actually found that there's no autocrats who were ousted. Actually, 7% of autocrats who started a war were ousted while the war that they started was ongoing. So the key point, and there's a lot of other research that also shows that dictators who initiate wars are very unlikely to be ousted so long as the war continues. And so for Putin, being at war actually shuts down the pathways that many groups inside Russia, citizens, the military, the security services, would be able to challenge him. So I argue, I very much believe that being at war actually is in Putin's personal interest. And so he has every interest to continue the war for as long as possible. So I do worry about the fact that the longer the war goes on, we could see a decrease in Western support. And so the answer isn't to pressure Ukraine to negotiate. The answer is to give them what they need to end it militarily on the battlefield. I think that's the most appropriate response because right now, I think the way that I look at it is this U.S. administration, the Biden administration, has heavily weighed the risks of escalation, and for good reason. But I don't think that they've adequately weighed the risks of protraction. And really, the risk is the longer that this continues, we could end up in the worst possible of all worlds where Russia is able to make gains over the long term. So that's, I guess, my take on which side does time favor. There is a risk that the longer this goes, that Western support will wane. And then I guess your question on foreign support for Putin, yes, there are some signs that Putin might be having problems, but I think we could marshal just as much evidence to suggest that Putin is not isolated. I think it's only something like 34 countries that have actually imposed sanctions on Russia. Most of these countries, China, India, and others in the global south, they continue to abstain on votes in the UN that favor Ukraine. They continue and have actually increased trade with Russia. There's a lot of different reasons for this. A lot of these countries have their own historical relationships. Some have important economic or defense relationships. But I think we have to also be really clear that there's many countries in the global south who don't want to back the United States, or at least they don't view this confrontation the same way that the Biden administration has framed it, which is a kind of a war between autocracy and authoritarianism. And they certainly don't want to be dragged into the confrontation with China. So the problem is that Russia's narratives are falling on fertile soil. A lot of countries, I think, are buying into what Russia is selling in these areas, and it's a problem. I think the United States, the Biden administration recognizes it's a problem. The EU certainly recognizes it's a problem. And I think Ukraine recognizes that this is a problem, that we're going to have to do more to bring along countries in the global south to expand the coalition of countries that are opposed to Russia. And I think that's perhaps why Zelensky has agreed to the South African proposal to speak with African leaders as part of this peace mission. Right? South Africa has been a problematic country. They've been a supporter of Russia. They've done these joint military exercises with Russia and China. And yet Zelensky is willing to go along because I think we all recognize that this is a problem in the global south. And there's a whole heck of a lot more that we could be doing to try to bring those countries along.
Thank you. Okay, David, Zelensky spent a very fruitful week in Europe, visiting Paris, Rome, Berlin, London, and he came home with gifts in the form of additional weapons, most notably the Storm Shadows. Has this been a successful trip, and is it a strong response to Xi's long visit with Putin recently?
Well, John, first, thanks for including me with such distinguished colleagues on this panel. If I can just weigh in on the discussion before, particularly the differences between Andrea and Vladimir. Putin may want to prolong this war. I think the question is whether he has the means and capability to do so. And I'm with Vladimir on this. I don't think he does. I think morale which has never been terribly high on the Russian side, is plummeting. And if the Ukrainians are able to succeed in the counteroffensive, I think the scenario of a Russian military collapse is a distinct possibility. That doesn't necessarily lead to Putin's ouster. He has such totalitarian control inside the country. But I wouldn't exaggerate Russia's ability to prolong this war. But let's also be clear, nobody wants this war to end sooner than Ukrainians. They're the ones who are dying in this war, but they also want to end this war with victory so that Russia doesn't do again what it has been doing to Ukraine going back since 2014. I also would just add, I really wish President Biden would get out and explain to the American people why U.S. support for Ukraine is such a critical U.S. national interest. He gave a good speech in Warsaw. That is not in the United States. He needs to go out. Otherwise, he is ceding the field to the naysayers and to the Russian apologists. And if he were to get out and give a major speech explaining why U.S. support is so critical, I bet you Republican leaders in the Congress would say, we don't agree with Joe Biden on pretty much anything else, but we sure agree with him here. And I think it would help solidify support. I also think Zelensky's trip in Europe has helped bolster support in the United States. He had, I think, a very successful trip to Rome, Berlin, Paris, and London, drumming up additional military assistance. But also showing the United States that there is growing burden sharing, which is a very important issue, something that U.S. officials and representatives in Congress have been demanding. I think this has been a very timely and important visit. I think it sends a strong boost of morale for Ukraine, a sign of confidence in Ukraine's ability on the counteroffensive and to continue to achieve victory. I very much take to heart Wes's concerns. I think those are really serious concerns that Ukrainians are factoring in. But as Wes also pointed out, the Ukrainians have been so amazing in this battle, so innovative, such quick learners that we shouldn't underestimate their ability to go beyond what expectations are, while at the same time trying to rein in expectations so that if things don't go all that well, people don't say, okay, well, it's time to negotiate this and bring it to an end. On the issue of China, very quickly, the Ukrainians are in a bit of an awkward spot. They don't want China to move to the degree where they provide military assistance. And talking to some U.S. officials this week, the sense is China has not done so. There's some issues about some dual-use technology, but they have not provided the military assistance so far. I think they do want to entertain these Chinese initiatives, but I don't think they put a lot of stock in them. I wouldn't put a lot of stock in them. And so it's a way to try to maintain the proper balance with Beijing as things proceed.
Thank you, David. This has been a very rich discussion, but we were actually a little bit behind schedule. So please try and keep your answers to the following questions to 2 minutes, if you can. Okay, Andrei. Ben Hodge has been arguing for some time that Ukraine should be able to break the land bridge connecting Russia through occupied Donbass to Crimea. Some people say you can do it only if we give Ukraine F-16s and ATACMS, which we're not giving them. But others like Ben think it may be do otherwise. Your thoughts on this?
Well, so first of all, obviously, I agree with Ben that we need to retake Crimea. I mean, I cannot be that optimistic regarding the timing, as he says they will do this by the end of this summer. I would love to, but I don't know where he gets that assurance. But we certainly will do it sooner than later. The thing is that. Obviously, this Crimean story has lots of doubts from all kinds of from both sides of Atlantic in Europe and in US. Lots of people saying that we should not pursue that, and there's a whole debate with a policymaking community. And I think that debate is missing the point that under no circumstances Ukraine can take policy of not pursuing Crimea. Because as soon as we take policy that we are not pursuing part of our country, we already lost, and we're not going to do that. So whoever is expecting Ukraine to say, okay, we somehow do the strategic planning, we somehow wants to finish the war, but we're not going to address Crimea, this person is wrong. I mean, we certainly will address Crimea one way or the other sooner or later. Crimea has lots of Crimea is not just a piece of land. Obviously, this is also a Black Sea and Sea of Azov. which means this is a destabilization and a threat to the whole south of Ukraine, and and to the global food stability and to global freedom of navigation and lots of other things. Crimea is so anyway. We will certainly address that issue. Now, question is about the ATACMS and F-16s. I think that we need to finally grow out of the considering each capability separately, because to be honest with you, this has already been too much. We're running after howitzers, then we're running after HIMARSs, then we're running after tanks, then now we're running after the F-16s. And what we should be running after is a joint understanding that we're going to win this war, and then develop a strategic plan, develop campaign plan, and then resource that campaign plan, rather than go for isolated discussions whether we need this is actually one of the most amazing thing which I'm seeing during the last year and this year, is how the discussion from the victory gets into the discussion of whether we need tanks or not, as if there is no such concept as combined arms operations, where we understand that there is no Wunderwaffe. I mean, there is no like miracle weapon which would be like delivering a victory. And many journalists and observers who are looking, I mean, they're saying, oh, Ukraine is just like coming up with more and more ideas. They got one type of weapon, then they got another type of weapon, then they got another type of weapon, and so on. And we're not. What we're trying to pursue, what we're trying to do is we're trying to convince people that, I mean, let's just win this war. Let's come up with a single plan. Let's come up with a single campaign plan and resource it. And now, if we have this idea that we're winning this war and we need a combined campaign plan, I would like to go to any NATO general and ask whether he would pursue that campaign plan without aviation and see what they say. Because no single general, either from Air Force or from any other forces, will say that, yes, Russians are going to use their aviation, but we will not, and we will still plan to win this war. This is not going to happen. So yes, I mean, if we're going to build up a force which would be able to win against Russians, we need to think about long-term capabilities, not just to think about the counteroffensive. Of course, for that counteroffensive, aviation is not going to come, because it would take months and months to set up the bases, to set up mechanics, to set up supportive maintenance, etc., all these airfields, etc. But if we don't do it now, if we're still arguing a year after today about aviation, we're not going to build it, because it is a long-term capability which takes a long time to build. And I have to remind, and Wes knows this very well, is that we've been talking about this with DoD and with other parts of U.S. administration exactly a year ago. Exactly a year ago, we've been raising points about let's build up a joint plan, let's build up the necessary capabilities, and let's build up our position about the aviation. And at that time, and since then it didn't go anywhere. So I think that we need to address concerns about aviation, of course, and it does take time, it does take training, it does take money. However, each of these concerns could be addressed like in its own way. I mean, and there are nations which are offering us funding, for example. There are nations which are offering us F-16s. Not just United States, of course. United States have to approve that and so on. But there are ways to avoid those material concerns which are about provision of weapons. But the main concern is what is our strategic and main overall campaign plan? It needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we'll always be running after the isolated stories like that. And finally, I would like to say that we need to look beyond the counteroffensive. Too much attention is and too many over expectations are to the part of the campaign, which is, of course, it will be limited by time, because I don't think we can expect Russian front to crumble, and we can expect some of the parts of Russian troops to collapse, and I do agree that it's most likely is going to happen, but we cannot count on the fact that this counteroffensive will resolve the whole war. I mean, that would be a huge mistake. And that over expectation and overestimation, I think that will end up with frustrations, which we need to kind of settle right now. We should not be expecting too much from this. And also, it may be a series of the events rather than one ongoing event, which stops with the final defeat of Russians. We will try to do that, but of course we cannot count on that. But then we need to look beyond And so far, from what we see, is that very few organizations and very few governments looking beyond that. And when we look beyond, we see long-term stories such as aviation and other ones, which we need to look.
Andre,
Thank you.
please, we don't have much time. Okay, Wes,
Yeah.
very quickly. So some observers think that there's reluctance in Washington to send the ATACMS and the F-16s because they think if Ukraine makes great progress towards perhaps taking Crimea, Putin may, in fact, use weapons of mass destruction. What are your thoughts about this?
So we're at the heart of the issue here, John. And this is a familiar pattern by the United States, really. If you look at I'll try to get this out very quickly. If you look at what happened in the Korean War, we didn't put full forces in to defeat Kim Il-sung when he crossed the DMZ. We held MacArthur back. We were afraid of a confrontation with Russia. Russia put pilots in and flew their pilots against us at the DMZ. The war finally ended when Stalin died and when MacArthur was relieved and Eisenhower became president. Eisenhower put atomic cannon on the ground in Korea, and that finally brought the armistice to bear. We tried the same approach in Vietnam. We penny-packeted air power. We argued in the White House about whether we should strike a rail junction or a bridge. And at one point, we told them, please run 3 strikes a day, go at 10, 2, and 4. I mean, it was terrible micromanagement. It failed. And ultimately, we had a great American president, in my view, who did a lot for this country, who failed to focus on the essential points that Andre just made about designing a campaign to win. Instead, he wanted to sort of he wanted to hold it at arm's distance so he could work domestic programs. And you only have to look at what happened in Tet 68 to understand the consequences of this. Afghanistan, Iraq were different. We weren't dealing with a potential confrontation. Well, now we are. We're going to have to see our way through this. If we believe in Western democratic values, we're going to have to inch our way up the risk schedule. Mr. Putin can do what he wants to do. We've got to tell Mr. Putin you're not winning under any circumstances, and we've got to mean it. And I support what David said about the president going to the American people. He's got to go to the American people. Andre's right, in my view. Andre Kendall Taylor's right that this could go on for a long time. And it's not in our interest for it to go on for a long time. We're dealing with China and all the vagaries of that. So yes, this is the heart of the issue. Russia has nuclear weapons. Are we going to say, in that case, Mr. Putin, we're willing to bleed out Ukraine, but please don't threaten us with any nuclear weapons? Because in that case, all that we've said and stood for 70 years, we didn't really mean it. And this is why so many nations have not lined up with the United States. This is why the global South is sitting on the side. They don't think we really believe what we've said, what our diplomats have tried to do, what we've invested in. They don't believe we really mean it when push comes to shove. They've looked at American history. So this is really a wake-up call for America. This is where America will go forward in the 21st century or not.
Okay. Thanks, Wes. That was great. Vlad, again, quickly. In your view, what would be the impact in Moscow of a Ukrainian offensive that liberated several hundred square kilometers of territory or that broke the land bridge?
It will have a significant psychological impact. And I strongly disagree with Andrea. And many commentators actually say that we can treat Russian society and Russian public opinion as a sort of constant, that Putin controls it and nothing is going to happen. If you are talking about dictators not crumbling during the wartime, only 7% or something, Russia, as a matter of fact, is within that 7%, should be. Because we are a very different society. We are not Iraq under Saddam Hussein or not Uganda. It always happened. In 1905, we had a revolution after a loss in the Russo-Japanese War. After World War I, empire collapsed. War in Afghanistan had greatly contributed, maybe not decisively, but greatly contributed to collapse of the Soviet regime. War in Chechnya had contributed significantly to the demise of the popularity of President Yeltsin. Putin knows that. Again, look at the fact that he still hasn't called for a second wave of mandatory mobilization at the time when he badly needs it. He badly needs it, but he's not going for it because I think that's what kind of clearer sign of lack of complete control over society you need if you have that. So Putin, no, he's invested a lot in trying to convince you that he has full control and can wage this war forever. His purpose is to instigate exactly that type of thinking in the West that no, this cannot last for too long. So if it's going into a protracted mode, we need to somehow change our approach. This is what he exactly wants you to think. But as a matter of fact, his resources are limited. His domestic support is limited. And if Ukraine gets back significant parts of the territory, and particularly at least parts of Crimea, that will send shockwaves and will have a tremendous impact on public opinion and domestic support, even to a bigger extent than the mobilization did in the autumn. So yes, Putin rules with fear, but he does not completely control the society, and he's very much afraid of the setback that he might receive. Counteroffensive will play a great role in this regard.
Vlad, thank you. Andre, I know you have to leave shortly. Feel free to answer that. I'm sure you want to. And also, I was going to ask you about what you're expecting in NATO, but please also quickly.
I hope Vlad's right. I mean, I certainly do, but just kind of looking at the relationship between wars and leaders in this comparative perspective, which, yes, of course, there's many things that are unique about Russia, but kind of from that comparative political science perspective, my sense is that this can be very destabilizing. The thing that is very stabilizing. The thing that is destabilizing is a major setback and a military defeat. And in that case, then I do think that there is a chance, however small it may be, that a military defeat of Russia could destabilize Putin and raise the risk of regime change there, or at least of leadership change. So I hope he's right. But on the NATO question, I think I'm just going to be really quick and take this opportunity to fully endorse the excellent memo from the Atlantic Council's Sandy Vershbow and Ian Brzezinski. I think they've laid out a terrific roadmap of what we would hope for out of the Vilnius summit, everything from fully endorsing Ukraine's war aims, fortifying the eastern flank, launching a NATO effort that would help increase member state production of defense capabilities so that we're sure that we can sustain the support that Ukraine needs to stay in this war as long as it takes. And then most importantly, the roadmap that they laid out for increasing Ukraine's integration into NATO while the war is ongoing. I think that's critically important. They laid out a way of doing that through the creation of this Ukraine Deterrence and Defense Partnership. I think it's excellent. And I think they've really hit the mark on what we would all hope for from the Vilnius summit.
Thank you very much. David, you'll have the final word before we turn to audience questions. Your thoughts on U.S. military aid to Ukraine, and also, since Andrea did not fully address NATO, although what she said was excellent, what do you expect to happen at, in fact, the Vilnius NATO summit?
Let me just quickly say, John, I think when we talk about whether this will destabilize Putin or not, we're getting distracted from what the goal and focus should be. It should be on helping Ukraine win and defeating Russia. What the fallout from that will be the fallout. I think it's quite beyond our control, although I paradoxically would argue we have more influence over the situation inside Russia today than we have in 30 years. And so by providing Ukraine with the help it can, then whatever pieces fall out from that will be. I think in the case of U.S. military assistance, just to underscore what Wes said, there has been a really frustrating pattern of U.S. decision-making where the Ukrainians ask for certain weapon systems. We say no, they come back and ask again. We say maybe, they come back a third time and we say yes, finally. In the course of that dithering and delay, Ukrainians are dying. And so we need to accelerate our decision-making. When we say Ukraine does not need F-16s today, Well, they're going to need them. So let's decide yesterday that they need F-16s and make sure we move them ahead. Because if we're not making the decision to provide them now, we're just going to delay the whole process of getting them what they need. They need everything right now in order to win. And this is why I think President Biden should go out and say, helping Ukraine win, not just staying with Ukraine as long as it takes, but helping Ukraine win is in U.S. national interest. And Ukraine will define what that is. It may change over time, but I would argue it means driving every Russian occupying and invading force from Ukrainian territory. Otherwise, it will be like Groundhog Day. We'll see this movie over again. So let's help Ukraine win. And the president go out and say that. And just quickly on NATO, I would say no country deserves membership more than Ukraine. NATO at this point, frankly, would be lucky to have Ukraine become a member. So I would hope that NATO does move forward more forthrightly at Vilnius, though I'm not optimistic that it will.
Okay, thank you. All right, we've got a bunch of audience questions. I'll start with one from Dr. Harlan Ullman for Wes. What do you believe Ukraine's objectives are in the upcoming offensive and hence their strategy?
I think, Harlan, that they have a cascade of objectives. And, you know, at the top of the wish list of the objectives would be they drive the Russian forces out by penetrating Crimea, dislocating Russian logistics in the rear, and then sweeping in a second offensive to go through the Luhansk and Donetsk and roll the whole thing up. And there are probably follow-on plans for that. But you can't start discussing these objectives without looking at what they really must do. They must regain the battlefield initiative. They must show the capacity to the people of Ukraine that there is hope to regain their territory, and they must retain Western support. These are political objectives, and this is a strategic military operation with political objectives. So I think you have to look at the politics first, and I think that drives the character of the military operation. When I look at military operations, I always look at what is the best outcome, what you're trying to do, and what are the things you don't want to happen. What you don't want to happen is a major Russian air offensive against mass Ukrainian forces that blunts and culminates the Ukrainian counteroffensive. What you don't want to happen is a rush to the barricades that the Russians have put up and then get stalled there and lose your force. So they've got to look at how to move forward to gain the strategic political objectives and fit the military actions into that framework.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from David Symes. Andre, I'll give this to you. Can we not flood the Russian internet with genuine information on the invasion of Ukraine? And for that matter, what's happening to Russian citizens fighting there?
I'm also interested in what Vlad has to say, but I think part of the issue is, yes, there are VPNs, there's Telegram, there's YouTube, there are other areas where Russians can access relatively uncensored information. My understanding is that there hasn't been an extremely high interest in many Russians to do so. Part of what I am paying a lot of attention to is the impact of this war on Russians. And what it seems to be, I know, and I'm sure Vlad is going to take a very different track to this, but many Russians certainly did not agree with the invasion of Ukraine. But the issue is now, after the fact of the invasion, many Russians are afraid of what a Russian defeat would mean. And Putin certainly goes to great lengths to try to increase those anxieties among Russians. I mean, that it has been very much a rally around the flag effect. Whereby many Russians, large segments of the population, do support Putin, or at least don't want to see Russia defeated. So that is part of the challenge. And in that sense, kind of permeating that information bubble becomes very difficult. There is information that exists, there are VPNs, but the fact of the matter is that many Russians aren't accessing that information.
Thank you, Vlad. You may want to comment on that, but I have another question for you as well from James Duran. Is Wagner a spent force? And what in the world is Prigozhin up to with his overt naming and shaming of Shoigu and Gerasimov, among others, and even Grandpa, who many people think is Putin?
Yeah, on Prigozhin, yes, to make the long story short, Wagner is a spent force, and the behavior of Prigozhin is what we see is taking place out of desperation, because he actually, like several months ago, he took the lead saying, I'm going to show now to the Ministry of Defense how to really wage an effective war. I took Solidar, I'm going to take Bakhmut, and so on. And he terribly failed. So I think his, barrage of public attacks right now is basically trying to explain his failures and shift it onto somebody else's shoulders, Shoigu, undersupply of ammo, and so on. Yes, Wagner, consider it gone. It will play some limited part in the future, but and I think also the Russian Defense Ministry is extremely angry with Prigozhin and Wagner getting out of control. So they will try to shut it down eventually over time. So I think we should stop talking about Prigozhin and Wagner too much. They play some role, but it's going to decrease. On the Russian public opinion, listen, I think you really got to start with over 20 years of Russians living in a full information and censorship bubble. So when you talk to ordinary people about Putin's aggression in Ukraine, nobody likes it. If you want proof, please go to pre-war polls taken days before the actual invasion. Only 5% thought the invasion is likely, and over 50% said that they are terrified with such a prospect, and they thought it's all Western propaganda. But people say, listen, everybody's been doing it. America has been bombarding Iraq, and NATO has been bombarding Libya, and so on. So why can't we? That is the attitude from those who some people claim are the majority supporting Putin's invasion. However, when people find out about the reality of barbaric atrocities, war crimes, and so on, that matters. This is why Ilya Yashin got 8.5 years in prison specifically for one broadcast about Bucha. That's the most censored item in Russia at the moment, wartime atrocities. So yes, people really do have access to independent information, but most of them are so terrified with this that they just don't want to know. So it's a very painful process to increase our audience to which we talk to. It's significant. The outreach of opposition broadcasting is between 30 and 40 million unique viewers per month on social media. That's fairly significant. And the support for Putin and the support for the war is steadily going down in the whole past 15 months. Not as quickly as we would like it to be, but the trend is very, very clear, and our efforts greatly contribute to that. I think the main problem is that people don't see how they can influence this, so they prefer to just disconnect and make it look like it's not their business, they don't want to know. That is not even, there's very little aggressive sentiment regarding Ukraine. You see that they are investing great efforts in voluntary recruitment for big money to go and fight in Ukraine with near zero success. Nobody comes up. There is zero motivation in the society to actually participate in this. But the apathy is the biggest factor. We're trying to break through that with some limited success, but over time, still it works in our direction, not in Putin's direction.
Thank you. Okay, Andrei, Matt Ryan asks the following question. Given Ukraine's lack of experience breaching fortifications in heavily mined areas, what are the prospects for them to achieve success with the offensive? And are the techniques and strategies required something that can be learned quickly? I just want to add to this question, Russian military bloggers with a great deal of disdain are referring to the Russian fortifications as the quote unquote Fabergé line, as in the Fabergé eggs, which are beautiful but fragile. Anyway, so your thoughts on this question?
So I've spoken to a few specialists in this regard, and they obviously understand that in the current maneuver warfare, to put lots of hopes on a very basic fortifications which we currently see built in the areas, and they were quite haphazardly built. it's just unrealistic to think that that will be a decisive factor. The length of the front is well above 1,000 kilometers. Plus, we're talking about south, and there is absolutely no way with the current forces which we see, Russia can hold all those positions equally. So they certainly will have some positions where they would have a larger force. In some positions, they would have a less significant. I probably, it would be enough to say that Ukraine would be a bit opportunistic with the selections of the areas of counteroffensive. So of course it will look at the intelligence. By the way, the intelligence coming from our partners, most of all, of course, United States, is extremely detailed. So we do know pretty much everything which happens on the Russia side and the operation for the operational depths. Down to like number of tanks, vehicles, and platoons, and so on. So essentially, I mean, I don't think they would be able to build up something really which will hold the campaign. Indeed, it may complicate certain areas, but not like dramatically.
Thank you. Okay, David, I think we'll give you the last question. It's from Tim McQuillan. There are rumors that Lukashenko is in poor health. Is this good or bad news for Ukraine's counteroffensive and beyond? Can the opposition in Belarus viably step into power, or does it mean likely that Lukashenko plans a power handover in effect to Putin?
I've argued for a while that Ukrainian victory would redound to Belarus's benefit. I now wonder whether Lukashenko's demise could redound to Ukraine's benefit. I think it will remove any question, and I don't think there is a high likelihood of this, of Russia using Belarus again for any further offensives. It may raise questions about Russia's intentions of putting tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. I think Lukashenko's demise could embolden the people of Belarus, free them from nearly 30 years of the brutal dictatorship that they have endured. And I think that could further embolden Ukrainians as well. So I think the repercussions of this would be significant. Russia, of course, does not want to see any of that. But again, it comes back to between what Putin may want and Russia's capabilities. I actually don't think Russia will have the assets and capability to go into Belarus in a serious way. Belarus is far more defenseless than Ukraine is. The two are not comparable. But Russia has an opportunity, I think. Let me put it this way. Russia, I don't think, has the bandwidth to deal with a major problem in Belarus with leadership change, while also being bogged down in Ukraine at the same time. So I think this could be beneficial to Belarus, certainly, and also to Ukrainians. Well, and hopefully in the end to Russians as well.
You were so concise. We have time for one more question. It's from Joel Sokolsky, and it's for Wes Clark. If Russia were holding back air power to be used against the Ukrainian counteroffensive, would the U.S. be aware of this? And if so, what can the U.S. and its allies do to meet this danger?
I'd like to say the U.S. would be aware of it. And we have seen reports. We know how many Russian aircraft available. We know how many they've lost generally. We know they've got the substantial majority of their force intact. We don't know everything about it just behind it. We do know they've staged aircraft forward. We have an early warning that they're coming in mass. Yes, we would. But I see this, all of these missiles coming in and so forth, partly as an effort to exhaust Ukrainian air defenses before the Ukrainian ground forces begin to move. When Ukraine moves its ground forces, it's got to have air protection for those forces. And as Andre said earlier, no NATO general would ever say you should run a major operation like this and not be able to control the airspace over it. And we're relying almost exclusively on ground-based air defense for this. I hope we've got enough. Now, we're dealing here at the unclassified level. So we don't really know what's available, how many systems, how mobile they are, and what the planning is. I just want to caution everybody on this call. I've seen too many military operations where we listen to our own music. We pump up our forces. We have confidence in ourselves, and we can't wait for it to unfold so we can smash the enemy. I've seen it again and again and again. It's the psychology of military operations. And you know what? The enemy has a big vote on this. This is not the Super Bowl. There's no reason to rush into this. And don't expect that you're going to have immediate favorable results. This is going to be a slog. It's going to be a gnawing through. Be wonderful if the Russian forces collapse. Be wonderful if it's over in 3 weeks. Don't be counting on that. Don't listen to those people who build up these expectations. It's really dangerous strategically for us.
Thank you. Excellent way to end this. Thanks to everyone. Andrea, who had to leave a little bit early. It was a wonderful conversation. We'll be doing more on this subject in the days to come.